It's not always important to know whether a wheel trade option is going to be assigned or not. When Monday comes around, the wheel can be perpetuated whether Friday's option was assigned or not. But in times when it's important to know, which is the case with skate objective traders, or if the investor wants to avoid that over the weekend gap risk that we've already talked a little bit about in previous episodes, well, then the best bet is to close or to roll everything to close that strike price. Just avoid having any short options on that are at risk of being pinned. The scenario of pinning, it's actually mathematically more common than a typical random distribution would indicate it is. What happens a lot is what is called strike price clustering.
Hello, Wealth Builders. You're listening to Wealth Building with Options. Here's your host, Dan Passarelli.
Hey, Wealth Building family. Welcome to episode 58, Predicting Assignment. But before we jump in today, let's talk about how you can make many, many friends today. You know the best way to make a friend? It's to share something with them that can make them wealthier. It's true. Studies prove it. So the best thing you can do today is to tell someone about the Wealth Building with Options podcast. That, and of course, to become a paid subscriber. With your paid subscription, you'll get video extra podcast episodes so you can get hands-on video training on things we talk about on the show, subscriber-only posts where I drill down on a stock, event, or trading opportunity and share trade ideas. You'll get all my covered call and cash secured put trades that I'm making in my real brokerage account. You'll get access to our monthly online Ask Me Anything webinar, and you'll get our unusual options activity alerts on options income trades, even like credit spreads, and much more. And the best part is your paid subscription helps to keep this show on the air. To become a paid subscriber, just go to the Wealth Building with Options Substack page and sign up. The shortcut to that page is wealthbuildingpodcast.com. That's wealthbuildingpodcast.com, and choose a monthly or annual subscription. Or for the best value, become an all-in wealth builder and get everything I mentioned, plus our Friday group coaching, our Smart Income video class, which alone is valued at more than the subscription to the podcast, and get on the wait list for a signed copy of my new book, Build Consistent Wealth with Options, scheduled for release on April 28th of 2026. One thing I do for a little break during the day, or sometimes to procrastinate when I need to record a podcast episode, is to play the New York Times puzzles on my phone. There are a few I enjoy. Connections is one of my favorites, Strands, Spelling Bee, and of course, Wordle. I'd like to say I do it to keep my mind sharp, but really it's just a diversion that I enjoy. I like playing games. I always have. Tell me the rules of a game and I'll figure out how to win, or at least give it my best shot. The New York Times game I've been playing a lot lately is Crossplay. It's a lot like Scrabble, but the double and triple word and letter bonuses are in different spots than the board game. What's different about this one is that you can play against another player. So Mrs. Wealth Building with Options, my wife Kathleen, and I have been playing it at lunch pretty much every day. Kathleen is a word person. She worked as a copy editor for some well-known publishing companies. She has a little trophy on her desk from a spelling bee from when she was a kid. She is a word person. and she played Scrabble all the time when she was younger. She is very good at this game. I, on the other hand, can barely spell. All right, well, maybe that's a slight exaggeration, but I can assure you, when I was writing Build Consistent Wealth with Options, my spell check was definitely working overtime. But when I worked on the trading floor, during the slow periods of the day or in low volatility regimes when not much was going on, the traders in my pit would play games. We'd play Hearts, the card game we'd play on the computer, and the loser had to buy lunch for the whole pit. And sometimes we played other games, and one of them was Scrabble. The thing about traders is we are a competitive bunch. And so I learned how to play Scrabble from a strategy standpoint to compete with these other cutthroat game players. When Mrs. Wealth Building with Options and I play crossplay, it is a real battle. I acknowledge that though our record is close, she's a little better than I am. And, well, I have to acknowledge that because she's involved in production of this show and listens to all the episodes before they go out. Hi, honey. In a game, can you ever predict your opponent's next move? What will happen next? Of course, you can't predict everything. Like in crossplay or Scrabble, I can't predict what letters my opponent will play. But from a strategy perspective, you can usually pretty much predict where on the board your opponent is most likely to play their tiles, because a strategic player will always try and play the spot on the board with the best premium squares available. The triple word score ones are always the first choice. Then either triple letter or double word score, depending on the tiles and placement and length of the word. And lastly, the double letter score. And of course, I always try and play them in that order, even if I don't have a great word, because I know that's where my opponent will be or should be, and so will be, planning to go. At least I can block them from getting points, even if I can't lock in a high scoring turn in that spot. Either way, there's usually one or two strategic spots to play on the board. And when you think about it that way, it's not really that hard to anticipate the other player's next move. When I'm coaching wheel investors, one of the questions I get asked a lot is, well, how do I know if I'll get assigned? The key is, what is the most strategic move for the trader on the other side of my trade, who's usually a market maker? That, of course, and understanding the expiration process. Most of the time, it makes sense to exercise any option that's in the money at expiration. As of the writing of this book, if a listed securities option is in the money by 1 penny or more at expiration, the Options Clearing Corporation automatically exercises it by default. If it's not in the money by 1 penny, the option will simply be left to expire by the OCC. But option holders, the ones that are long the options, they have the right to exercise the option. And those who are long the option can override that default that the OCC sets and choose to exercise or to not exercise regardless of the in-the-money status. To make it simple, I'll skip a lot of the nitty-gritty mechanics and a lot of the back office terminology and such. For most options, after the market closes on expiration day, the owner of an option has a window of time to contact their broker and instruct them if their intention is contrary to the default process. It's likely the brokerage firm asks traders to give such instructions within a window that closes a little bit earlier than the Options Clearing Corporation's official deadline. And they do that so that the brokerage firm itself has enough time to relay your instructions to the OCC. The long option holder either gives a phone call to or chats online with a customer service representative from whatever their brokerage firm is, and they just simply tell them what they want to do. Something like, well, the ABCD 220 strike calls that expire today are in the money by 2 cents, but don't exercise them. Or, hey, I own 20 of these WXYZ 175 puts that expire today. They're out of the money by a penny, but I actually want to exercise them. Or I actually want to exercise 5 of them and not 15 of them. You, as a wheel trader, though, well, you're not going to have to contact your broker because you're not long the option. You are going to be short the call as a covered call or put as a cash secured put. You don't have a right. You have an obligation. You will either get assigned or you won't get assigned. Now, this person who's long the option, they're not necessarily the same person who bought it from you originally, and it really doesn't matter regardless. All you need to know, and all you're ever going to know, is whether your short option got assigned or did not get assigned. And this is just going to show up in your brokerage account sometime before the next trading session. Now, most of the time, things go according to how you would think they would. It's pretty intuitive. Options that are in the money by a penny get assigned, and options that are out of the money don't get assigned. But when and why might things not go that way? Think about it from the other person's perspective, the option holder's perspective. One of the most common expiration day hiccups happens when a stock is what is called pinned. A stock that is pinned is a stock that is right exactly at the strike price. Though as we talk about this is going to be valid even if it's just close to the stock price, but technically pinned means exactly at the stock price. Your counterparty, who again is someone who is long the option, who potentially may exercise this pinned option, well, that person is a random person, but most likely it's going to be a market maker. Market makers classically like to trade delta neutral. Now, without taking into regard every single option they have on or something, if they have, say, 100 calls that are pinned, so exactly at the money, that market maker is likely partially hedged on those long calls. They'll exercise calls based on how many short shares they have as a hedge after the bell has rung on expiration day. And that could be 0 or it could be 10,000 shares. So 1-to-1 hedge, right? It's probably somewhere in the middle. As the stock moves around, going above the strike and below the strike, market makers have to adjust their hedges. Right on the expiration bell, if the stock is above the strike by 1 cent, they will need to have 10,000 shares short against their 100 long calls. So that's 1-to-1. To offset the deltas and to have no directional exposure if they exercise all the calls, and then Monday morning, when the market opens, they'll be completely flat deltas. But in the last minute or so of the day, the stock can bounce around from being a penny in the money to being a penny out of the money, and they're buying and selling and trying to get the hedge right. What if, when the expiration day bell rings, they're only short 9,000 shares and they're pinned? Then the market maker is probably going to just exercise 90 of those calls and just simply not exercise the other 10. Even if they're in the money by a penny, they'll just sacrifice that 1 penny. They'd rather lose $10 than come in long 1,000 shares on Monday and risk the market falling. And that's the same thing if the calls end up out of the money by a penny or two. If they are, when the bell rings on expiration day, well, they need to have no shares. Maybe the market maker, in the process of trying to nail it right just as the bell is ringing, maybe they're short 2,000 shares. Well, in that case, to get flat deltas, even if they're out of the money by a penny or two, they'll probably exercise 20 of the 100 of them. Extended hour trading can also come into play. If a stock closes at, say, $69.90, but rallies in the extended hour sessions to $71, well, the owner of the 70 strike calls might exercise them, despite that they're technically out of the money based on the regular trading hours closing price. If the owner of those calls did nothing, then the calls would not be exercised. What does this mean for us wheel traders? Well, that kind of depends. It's not always important to know whether a wheel trade option is going to be assigned or not. When Monday comes around, the wheel can be perpetuated whether Friday's option was assigned or not. But in times when it's important to know, which is the case with skate objective traders, or if the investor wants to avoid that over the weekend gap risk that we've already talked a little bit about in previous episodes, well, then the best bet is to close or to roll everything to close that strike price. Just avoid having any short options on that are at risk of being pinned. The scenario of pinning, it's actually mathematically more common than a typical random distribution would indicate it is. What happens a lot is what is called strike price clustering. This means stocks empirically close at or really close to a strike price a lot more often than that log normal distribution would indicate. And there's a lot of reasons for this, and they're widely misunderstood, but they're a little out of the scope of what we're talking about here. What's important is to know that that happens, this phenomenon called strike clustering, and that increases your likelihood of being pinned. Early exercise, that can sometimes be a valid concern too. And it works a little differently for calls than it does for puts. As we touched on briefly in, an episode a long time ago, when an investor has a number of shares of stock in his or her account on the morning of the ex-dividend date, when the market opens, they get that dividend. Once the market opens, they can sell those long shares of stock seconds after they open, and they still get the dividend. So you've just got to have long stock in your account when the opening bell rings on the ex-dividend date. But what if somebody has long calls instead of long shares of stock? Well, no. In the case of long calls, they don't get the dividend. If they want to get the dividend, well, guess what they have to do? You guessed it. They have to exercise the calls the afternoon before the X date. They have to have the stock the next morning in order to get the dividend. And when I say get the dividend, I mean be eligible to get the dividend. The actual dividend payable date is actually later in the future. Should traders always exercise calls for the dividend, though? No, not always. When a trader exercises calls, they lose any and all of the time value, the extrinsic value that the option has. Exercising means they buy the stock at the strike price, and the option and any value, intrinsic or extrinsic, that it has just gets flushed down the old toilet. And that's fine for the intrinsic value component of the option, actually, because the intrinsic value is equal to the discount, if you will, that they get by buying the stock below the market. So if they exercise the 70 calls and the stock is at 73, well, the intrinsic value is going to be $3, but they're buying the stock at 70 and it's worth 73, so they're getting $3. So that all evens out in the wash. But the time value, the extrinsic value, that is given up. Interest is another thing that can be forfeited when an option is exercised as well. In specific, market makers or dealers who are usually trading hedged, well, they're going to have some stock shorted against long calls. They earn interest on the cash they collect on that short stock, and they like that. Exercising calls gets you long stock, which what? Closes the short stock position, right? They offset each other, then boom, there's no position. If they exercise the long calls, well, then they don't get the interest anymore. So there's some advantage to having the long call with short stock against it and collecting that interest. So between these two factors, the market maker, or really anybody, can decide whether it makes sense to exercise the call or not. If the dividend that you'll get is greater than the time value plus the interest that you're going to give up, then the call should be exercised. And if the dividend is less than the time value and the interest, then you should not exercise. You just do what is in your greatest advantage. Just to kind of give a rule of thumb and not get heavy in the math here, for us wheel traders, the day before an ex-dividend date, in the money covered calls have a higher chance of being assigned. Okay? That's kind of all you really have to know. You can do the math and such, but that's the important thing to know. The day before an ex-dividend date, in the money calls become a lot more likely to be assigned. Now, puts, different ball game altogether. With puts, what we care about is interest costs. If a dealer or market maker is long, let's just say 100 deep in the money, 100 delta puts, that market maker would have to be long 10,000 shares as a hedge, right? Because each put represents the rights on 100 shares. And if they're deep in the money, close to 100 delta, if I am long 100 puts, I have to be long 100 shares for a direct hedge. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that that market maker is borrowing money and paying interest to be long those shares. Even if they're not actually borrowing money, they're foregoing earning interest on that cash, which would otherwise be in a money market account getting interest. So they're giving up that interest regardless. And bear in mind, they only own the shares just for a hedge. They're not bullish or anything like that. But either way, the market maker has an interest rate cost when they're long puts and shares of stock as a hedge. Now, deep in the money puts become more likely to get assigned when the cost of that interest is higher. When the cost of that interest is more than the time value of the put, which of course is what would be lost when they exercise, then it is in the market maker's best interest strategically to exercise the put. And you can think about it synthetically too. Long stock plus long put synthetically equals what? Long call, right? So if that dealer exercises that in the money put, well, then the market maker is throwing away a synthetic call, right? And that's good if the interest costs that are being saved are more than the call value, but bad if it's less. So strategically, it becomes obvious. Deep in the money puts have an increased likelihood of getting assigned. Do you have to do the fancy math? Maybe not necessarily. Just know that. Another assignment anomaly, if you will, is with what we call hard to borrow stocks. You might see that on your trading platform as HTB, That's how it shows up on the top of the Thinkorswim platform, HTB. That's what that means if you didn't know. Hard to borrow stocks, generally speaking, are heavily shorted. That means that a lot of people are already borrowing it. And there are not a lot of shares left to be borrowed because all the ones that are available to borrow have been borrowed. Who borrows this stock? Short sellers. So a good way to look at it is you can look at the short interest, which is published. There's a delay on it. It's about a 3-week delay in reporting. But if there's a lot of short interest as far as the percentage of the float of the stock, which is the available number of shares to trade, if there's a lot of short interest, it can become hard to borrow. But the best thing to do is just to look on your screen or ask your broker, is this hard to borrow? Now, the problem with borrowing shares to sell short for whatever reason, because you want to be short the stock, or as a hedger, is that the person who's loaning you the shares, well, they can ask for them back anytime they want. So let's say a market maker is short 300 deep in the money puts. Well, that market maker has to be short 30,000 shares to be hedged directly. What if the person or persons who are lending out those shares suddenly decides, you know what? I don't want to lend these out anymore. They call their broker and they say, take them back. I don't want to lend them anymore. Well, what does that mean to the market maker? Uh-oh. Yeah, their hedge just poof is gone. So market makers don't like just hedges magically disappearing. So what they do is a lot of times they'll pay up for puts that are in hard to borrow names. They do this so that they can lessen the chance of needing to be short the stock and be in that position. And then strategically, as a precaution, these dealers might also exercise some of their long calls so that they can get long stock so that they don't have to be short stock, because they don't want this short stock just poof disappearing. So the bottom line there is this little nuance. Early exercise becomes somewhat more likely for in the money calls when a stock is hard to borrow. And that about wraps it up for this show. But before you go, please make sure you're subscribed on your favorite podcast platform, whether it's Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or whatever it may be. And if you would be so kind as to leave a comment, I would surely appreciate it. Let me know what you like or what you'd like to hear more of. Until next time, invest excellently.
Options involve risk and are not suitable for all investors. Before buying or selling an option, read characteristics and risks of standardized options. A link is provided in the show notes. To learn more about your host, Dan Passarelli, please visit markettaker.com.